Good morning. I'm Sherman Stanford, and this is Making Sense of the Chaos. In one way or another, aren't we all trying to do that every day of our lives? Or maybe we're trying to hide from the chaos because we can't make sense of it. Well, in this podcast and all the others and the ones to come, that's what we're going to be trying to do, make sense of the chaos. I don't think anyone ultimately makes complete sense of it because there's just way too much to make sense of, but we'll do our best. There are some few principles that we need to keep in mind to set the framework, the bones, as it were, for understanding the overall picture. First, God created the cosmos for His glory, not for man's. Second, the jewel of creation is man, that is, mankind. Third, although in no sense the author of evil, God ordained Adam's fall. Fourth, in Adam, the entire creation fell, not just all of humanity, but the physical cosmos as well. Paul tells us in Romans 8 that the creation groans in anticipation of the resurrection and the restoration of man and the cosmos with the defeat of sin. 5, as a result of the fall, God pronounced the curse of enmity between the seed of the woman, Jesus Christ, and all those in him who will spend eternity with God, and the seed of the serpent, that is, Satan, his demons, and the remainder of mankind. This is known as the great antithesis. 6, all subsequent human social experience is an outworking of this enmity. People fall into one or the other camps, and depending on where you are, your relationships with everyone else will be colored by that, by the fact of your where you are and where that other person or other persons are. 7th, the unregenerate are without excuse. They know God, but suppress the truth of God in culpable self-deceit. They, as Paul says, they exchange the truth for a lie. We've been talking about man's will and how man's will and God's sovereignty work together. We said yesterday that men who are unregenerate, that is, before they're regenerated in Jesus, that all that they say, think, and do is evil. And that seems a little bit strong. Some will argue that evil, unregenerate men often do choose good over evil. And that is undeniable in a certain sense, but untrue in the absolute sense. Unregenerate man, until he is regenerated, never chooses to submit to God in his thoughts, words, or actions. While he may acquiesce in doing what God has commanded, acquiescence is not godly submission. For instance, a good businessman may never lie or cheat his customers or his business associates because it's bad business. Now, is he in fact following God's law? Well, after a fashion, he is. But is it God's law he's following, or is it the businessman's creed, which happens to agree with God's law regarding these points? I submit it's not God's law. If he's an unregenerate, he's following the businessman's creed, which happens to acquiesce with God's law regarding these points. Now, it certainly is better to have people who follow God's law, even though they don't follow God, and who follow the law for their own reasons, but don't believe that God is fooled by that. No, he's not. But it certainly works to our advantage on earth to have people being kind and generous and not stealing and not lying and not killing one another, even though the reasons they do that lie in themselves, not in their submission to God. This sort of acquiescence will always be motivated by the belief that, for their own purposes, the behavior God has commanded is good for them and the instances before them, not by a desire to submit to God's will regardless of the consequences. That's why Paul says in Romans 3 that none is righteous, no, not one. I hope that makes sense to you. He's not saying that everybody is as bad as they could be all the time, all day long. That's not what he's saying. He's saying that there's no one who, unless his heart has been changed, there's no one who desires to please and honor God in everything he says, thinks, and does, or in anything he says, thinks, and does, because he values his own desires, his own self-will, more than he values the will of God, and to honor and please him. It's also why Solomon wrote in Proverbs 21:4 that the plowing of the wicked is sin. Well, how can plowing be sin? And isn't a farmer supposed to plow? Well, yes, but if he plows for his profit and not to glorify God, it's sin. Paul says that all that is not of faith is sin. Whatever you do that is not intended to glorify and honor God, not done in submission to God, is sin. Jesus captured this idea of fallen men being necessitated to sin by their own natures by telling us that, quote, the truth will set you free. Truly, truly, I say to you, everyone who practices sin is a slave to sin. This is at John 8:32 and 34. Here Jesus is referring not to one of his elect committing a sin. He's referring to those who choose a life of sin, those for whom sin is their master. He says that all those who have not been regenerated are slaves to sin. Their being slaves to their sinful desires guarantees that their choices will uniformly align with those sinful desires without any coercion by God. Okay? God may have decreed that they do X, but because they desire to do X, they will do X, not because God has decreed that. I mean, their reason for doing it is sinful. God's reason for decreeing it is good. Remember that all things work together for good to those who love the Lord and are called according to his purposes. So God plans and uses, as part of his plans, the sinful acts of men in order to bring good to pass. We use as our example Joseph in being sold into captivity by into slavery by his brothers, and also Jesus' crucifixion. But we know in our own lives we have countless examples of the evil that we have done or the evil others have done, ultimately producing good in our lives because God is in control of our lives. And he works these things together for good for us. Because their wills are free from coercion, there's a sense in which they freely choose to be slaves to sin, making their choices certain, sinful, and culpable, but not coerced. Those choices and the wills choosing them are therefore free in the sense of being uncoerced, although simultaneously they are in bondage to their own sinful desires stemming from their sinful natures, making them slaves to sin. This freedom Jesus calls slavery. But when we're sinning, we feel perfectly free. We chose to sin. We delight in our sins. We delight in our slavery? Yes, paradoxically, we do. A pastor friend of mine, paraphrasing the Prince of Preachers, Charles Spurgeon, who was a Baptist preacher in London in the late 19th century, and highly renowned, used to say there is no need to reconcile friends who are in perfect agreement. Man's free will and God's predestination are flip sides of the same coin and are thus in perfect agreement. Mysterious? Yes. Contradictory? No. While we should never accept contradictions, having no room for mystery in our belief system does not remove mystery from our world. It means our belief system has a mysterious hole in it which we cannot account for and thus refuse to see. Too often, clear and cogent thinking escapes through this unaccounted for hole of mystery. As discussed earlier, if by freedom is meant the power at any given time to choose from an infinite number of courses of action, accompanied by the power to perform those actions, then no one is free, not even God. God's not free. Well, he is free to do whatever pleases him, but it never pleases him to be other than who he is. He is not free to be a liar. He is not free to be a thief. He is not free to be anything other than who he is. He's not free to be unholy. He's not free to be unrighteous. He's not free to be limited in any existential way. He cannot choose to be anything contrary to his nature. Since even God is not perfectly free in that sense, it's certain that freedom must be acknowledged as conditional and limited in every human case. The first principle, then, is that freedom as a meaningful category is limited to those things which we have the power to perform. We cannot flap our arms and fly across the Atlantic. Therefore, there is no meaningful way to speak of freedom to do so, although no coercion is applied to prevent our doing it. In the same way, because men are limited by their natures, and because they are not able to act contrary to their strongest desires which flow out of their natures, it's meaningless to speak of their freedom to do so. All right? Is that clear? Who you are is who you are. And who you are is a combination of things that you love and things that you don't, that you hate. And all sorts of graduations between love and hate. But you're always subject to the desires that you have inside you. Those desires flow out of the nature that you were given, both the fallen nature or the redeemed nature, and the particular type of person that you are. Some people like math, and some people do not like math. Some people like chocolate cake, and some people like pineapple cake. I mean, the things that you like determine the choices you make, and those run across the entire spectrum of human possibilities. And we are always captivated by our strongest desires. Every one of us, all the time. I can't overstress that principle because it's just, it has to be understood. Even when you say, I really desired to do this, but I didn't because I thought that this other thing would have been better. Well, then clearly what you desired was the other thing more than doing that. Duh. Otherwise you would have done that instead of the other thing. In the same way, because men are limited by their natures, and because they are not able to act contrary to their strongest desires, which flow out of their natures, it is meaningless to speak of their freedom to do so. This is because, definitionally, it is always a person's strongest desire under the circumstance at the time of choosing to act that he follows with every choice he makes. While people do agonize over difficult choices, the truth is that they never agonize over whether to choose the thing they desire the most. They may agonize over deciding which thing they desire the most when they desire two or more things, if they desire those nearly equally. But they never hesitate in choosing their strongest desire once they have identified it. If I can't decide whether I like this more than I like that, then because you see, what I most want to do is what I most want to do. And if I can't decide what I most want to do, then I'm torn. But once I make up my mind about what I most want to do, then I do that. And if what I most want to do is not make up my mind about which of these I most want to do, then what I most want to do is not make up my mind, and so I don't. Does that make sense? You can't get away from it. It's so obviously true that we miss it. It's missing the forest for the trees. Where's the forest? Where's the forest? All I see is these trees. And sometimes the most obvious things are hidden because they're hidden in plain sight. It's true as this. When I was a young man, telling a bad story on myself. This was really, really foolish. This was before I was a Christian. I had gone to Europe for the summer. I had hitchhiked through Europe, and my last stop was in Amsterdam, where drugs flowed freely. And I had gotten a little bit of hashish. And like a typical young guy back in the early 70s, I used it. And then it was time to come back on the plane to America. And I thought, well, I don't want to throw this hashish away or give it away. I'd like to bring it back to America with me. But I knew that it was a very dangerous thing to do. And having courage where I should not have had, I decided that I was going to pack it in my duffel bag where my clothes was. I had been in the military, so I had a duffel bag. And I thought, now, if I'm going to put it in a duffel bag, it seems like the obvious thing to do is to put it in the bottom of the duffel bag, because the customs men are not going to want to dig all the way to the bottom of the duffel bag and see if I have something. At this point, you understand, I had a full beard and my hair was long. I looked sort of like pictures of Jesus Christ. Not that I was Jesus Christ or anything like that. But at any rate, I thought about that and I thought, yeah, but that's so obvious. So instead, what I did is I took a pair of pants and I put the hashish in the pocket of the pants and I put it right at the very top of the duffel bag. And so when I was going through immigration, the customs official looked me in the eye and asked me if I had anything I wanted to declare. And I said no. Did I have anything that I shouldn't be having? And I said no. And so he's watching me the whole time. He opens the duffel bag, okay? And I try to keep no expression on my face. And he immediately digs his hand all the way down to the bottom of the duffel bag and feels all around down there and doesn't feel anything. And so then he brings it up and closes the duffel bag and I go through. He never even looked through the clothes on top. Well, that was an example of something hidden in almost plain view. It would have been so easy for him to find it because it was right there. I say this as a humorous example, but not because I want to encourage anybody to do anything as stupid as I did that time. If I were given an opportunity to do that 100 times again, let me tell you how many times I would do it. 0. Both because I know it's a terribly wrong thing to do, and I don't do drugs at all any longer since I've been a Christian, and also because I don't have near the foolhardiness or courage or whatever you want to call it to try such a stupid thing. Anyway, the reason there is no essential difference between saying a man desires X, whatever X is, and saying a man chooses X is that apart from coercion, that greatest desire is the choice. The choice is the manifestation of the greatest desire. All right? So you don't have to tell me what you desired the most. You know, when people tell me, well, I really wanted to do that, but they're just making excuses. If they didn't do that, the but means they desired the other thing more. I really wanted to do that, but yes, I believe they really wanted to do whatever, but they didn't want to do it as much as they wanted to do the other thing they actually did. Apart from coercion, men never choose their second strongest desire, and even when they're coerced, they either desire most to avoid the consequences of not obeying the coercive force, or they do not. But the choices they make always conform to their strongest desires, even where coercion is applied. If we always knew a man's strongest desires, we could infallibly predict his choices. Okay? Does that make sense? I have a choice of, I'm going to tell the guy with the gun, okay, I'll do what you're telling me to do, and you don't shoot me, or no, I'm not going to do what you're telling me to do, and you can't shoot me. Now, my choices may only be 2, and they're both very bad choices, but I still am going to choose the one out of those 2 that I prefer, or that I least dislike, which is just turning I prefer upside down, but still comes out to the same thing. Does that make sense? To say, I hate these 2 things, but I hate this one worse than I hate this one, means I prefer doing this than to doing that. Does That makes sense? Humans certainly and undeniably have free wills in the sense of being free from coercion by God to choose whatever their choices are, the things that he has first chosen for them. However, to paraphrase John Calvin, this is a beggarly freedom to boast about for the seed of the serpent. Men, both fallen and redeemed, freely choose to pursue their desires in precisely the same channel that God ordained that they follow. Since the choices of fallen men always flow out of rebellion toward God, those choices are always sinful and culpable, even though they look perfectly innocuous. Because God has no obligation to restrain men from committing the sins they choose, even though by his grace he restrains many of the sins that men would commit, he has no culpability for their committing those sins when he does not restrain them. A lot of people want to say, well, if he can restrain us from committing sins, why doesn't he restrain all people from committing any sin at all times? Well, it's grace, okay? And grace is freely given, or it's not grace. If God owes an obligation to do a thing, then it's no longer grace, right? If you decide that you want to give me $100 because you're a good person and you just want to give me $100, well, that's wonderful. But does that mean that you owe the next fellow $100 because you gave me $100? No. Are you a bad person because you gave me $100 but you didn't give him $100? No. You're a good person to have given me $100, and I'm quite content with that, obviously, because I got the $100. But the other guy has no beef. If he thinks he has a beef, he doesn't understand grace. You didn't owe him or me the $100. You were free to give either one of us or neither one of us whatever. That's grace. As long as we think grace is owed, we don't understand what grace is. All right? Grace is a free gift. If it comes with strings attached, it's not grace. It's a bargain. It's a transaction. You do this, and then I'll do that. That's not grace. That's what we do when we make commercial transactions. But that's not grace. Grace has nothing to do with commercial transactions. Nothing. Okay? Let's get these categories distinct in our minds. Decreeing and allowing those sins to be committed is intended by God for good in an ultimate sense, although not necessarily for good to those committing them. Moreover, the sins in themselves are never good. Okay, sin is never good, never good. Though God uses it for good purposes, it is never good. It's always evil. Evil is evil. Okay? And there are only two categories to moral actions. They are good or they are evil. Now, there are degrees of evil. There's no question about that. It is certainly more evil to have committed 30 million murders, as Stalin did, than to have thought of committing 30 million murders. Okay? Now, morally, you're still guilty of wanting to murder 30 million people, but you didn't actually murder 30 million people, and the consequences for those actions are less. Therefore, the moral gravity is less, but the sinfulness remains still evil. The good that sins produce occurs because God is working them together with other things, not because they're good in themselves. Romans 8:28, remember the great passage on God's providence, tells us that all things work together for good for those who love the Lord. It does not say that that they are all good in themselves, that sin, for instance, is a good thing, nor that they work together for good for those who hate him. For the cosmic rebel, all things work together for his destruction, not for his good. If, however, we mean by freedom the ability to transcend our natures and make choices that do not flow out of our natures, choices which we do not desire most to choose at the time of choosing, that freedom neither exists nor could it conceivably exist. It is barred by our own desires, by our own natures. Among other things, This refers to the ability of fallen, unredeemed men to choose to follow God apart from His Holy Spirit by His act of grace, first regenerating them. You understand? They are free in the sense that nothing outside of themselves is preventing them from making that choice. Okay? They are not free in the sense that their own hatred for God gives them, puts submitting to Him as the last thing they want to do, not the first. And you never choose your last desire, you choose your first. Their first desire is always their own will, never to do God's will. Before they are regenerated, their continual greatest desire in reference to God is always hostility toward Him. Their greatest desire, as it touches upon any of their choices, always controls the choices they make. Even when they choose a thing they hate or fear, they choose it because all other choices seem worse to them under the circumstances existing when the choice is made. That makes the choice flow out of their greatest desire. We will get into this in more depth later. You think, well, really? Haven't we talked a lot about this already? Yeah, but we're going to talk some more about it later. Part of the confusion in this area is caused by fuzzy thinking. Fuzzy thinking, where not openly sinful, arises from faulty use of the rules of logic which govern sound thinking, including the failure to clearly define concepts and rigorously discipline ourselves to use the same word in the same sense at every point in our argument, unless we clearly signal the change of usage. In this case, necessity and compulsion are often confused for one another and used interchangeably, but they mean distinctly different things. Think about it. When you're doing something of necessity, do you make a distinction in your mind between this, I need to do this necessarily, and I feel compelled to do this? Those things seem pretty much the same, but they're not the same thing. Now, if we see necessity as referring to a choice that cannot be avoided because of reasons arising within ourselves, and compulsion as referring to the same choice arising out of a threat by another more powerful than we, then we capture the distinction between the two words. Unfortunately for clear thinking, the feelings of an action being necessitated and its being compelled are virtually indistinguishable. We feel something driving us, pushing us toward doing the thing. Okay, well now, whether it's necessity or compulsion, the feeling remains the same. For instance, if I drink water because I feel thirsty and desire to remain alive, I drink by necessity, but I am not compelled to drink. All right? Nobody's putting a gun at my head making me drink. I drink by the necessity of my own thirst and my desire to stay alive. However, if someone does point a gun at my head and commands me to drink the same glass of water, even if I'm thirsty, I may still drink out of necessity because I'm thirsty, but I'm also at the same time, I'm drinking out of compulsion. Now, if I'm not thirsty at all, I'm not drinking by necessity at all, right? Only out of compulsion. Because the motive for sin is internal, sinners sin out of necessity, but they never sin out of compulsion, although they may think they feel compelled by the urgency of their sinful desire. Do you understand that? That's the distinction. If you need to do something, that's necessity. If you are forced to do something by something outside of yourself, or the need arises because of something inside of yourself, that's necessity. Okay? Now, we sin out of necessity because the need to sin arises out of our own desires stemming from our own selves. Now, when we act based upon some external thing forcing us to act, then we act out of compulsion, coercion. God never compels us to sin, but the sin is necessitated by our desire and by His decree, because He knows our desires. In the end, there is a sense in which it is unintelligible to speak of men having freedom to choose God while they are in rebellion against him. Of course they are free to choose him, because they are not compelled to remain in rebellion. And of course they are in such bondage to their sinful natures and the desires flowing from them while they are in rebellion that there's no possibility of their choosing him. They necessarily rebel. They are free in the sense of there being nothing externally limiting their choice. They are not compelled to sin. They are unfree in the sense of their natures being alive to rebellion against him, dead to submission to him. That's what it means to say that somebody is spiritually dead. They're dead towards submitting to God. Once again, they are slaves to sin, says Jesus. Thus they sin necessarily, but not by compulsion. They themselves, as the embodiment of hostility toward God, are the source and limit of their bondage, not external coercion by God or anyone else. They are not victims, however. Theirs is a culpable bondage. Even worse, as slaves to their sin natures, paradoxically, they are their own prison keepers. Okay, that's all for today. We'll see you tomorrow. Tomorrow we're going to talk about the sin problem. I hope you have a good day. I hope you're doing well in this coronavirus epidemic, and that you're not going stir crazy or getting cabin fever. I hope you don't go out and kill somebody because you're so frustrated. At any rate, have a good day.